Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. And today we're going to be talking about something pretty complex and honestly a little controversial. We're going to be talking about transracialism.
Yeah, it's definitely a topic that gets people talking, that's for sure.
Yeah. And I think it's important for us to say right off the bat, we're not here to tell you what to think.
Right.
We're not here to judge anybody.
Yep.
We just want to understand what's going on here.
Exactly.
What the motivations behind why someone might identify as a different race than the one they were assigned at birth.
Absolutely. And to do that, we've got a bunch of different sources we're going to be looking at. We've got everything from, YouTube videos of people discussing this to Reddit posts to academic articles.
Yeah, and even some Wikipedia entries too.
Oh, yeah, of course. Got to have Wikipedia.
Always.
Yeah.
So let's just jump right in, okay?
So do it.
I think a good place to start might be with this Reddit post from the biracial community of Reddit. Um, it's written by a user named Ukesitopan.
Yeah.
And basically, they talk about how they've always felt really connected to Japanese culture.
Interesting.
Yeah, and it's not just like, oh, I like anime or I like sushi. It's much deeper than that.
Right.
They talk about how their family's been involved in martial arts, which, obviously has Japanese roots.
Mm-hmm.
And they've always been fascinated by Japanese technology, aesthetics, like ever since they were a kid.
So it's really ingrained.
Yeah, it's deep. And they also talk about how they always felt like a loner in school, didn't really fit in.
Right, that feeling of being an outsider.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then they started experimenting with different makeup styles, ones that are kind of associated with, Japanese appearance.
Okay.
And they say they finally started to feel accepted.
Interesting. So it sounds like there's a connection there between, wanting to connect with a culture and also wanting to be accepted socially.
I think so. And there's this one quote from Ukesitopan that I think really sums it up.
Okay, what is it?
They say, "From the bottom of my heart, I would like to be like them. I would like to experience their culture. I would like to be accepted as who I am without being called racist or whatever. Why can't we be the race we choose?"
Wow. Yeah, you can really hear that longing to belong and to define oneself, on their own terms.
Right.
And makes you think about how much we crave that sense of community and how race, even though it's a social construct, can become so central to identity for some.
Absolutely.
And it's not just this one person either. In the academic paper, Transracial Identity and the Effect on the Life Circumstances, it talks about how people use all sorts of things like hairstyle changes, tanning, makeup to try and align themselves with the ethnicity they identify with.
Yeah, they even mentioned specific examples, right?
Oh, yeah,
It's
tons.
like changing their name to something that sounds African or getting a nose job to look more British.
Right, and even wearing colored contact lenses.
So clearly these are people who are really committed to trying to embody this other identity.
Yeah.
It's more than just a superficial thing. And speaking of really wanting to identify with a specific race, there was this comment on a TikTok video we saw.
Hmm.
Someone walks up to Martina Big, who's made some pretty drastic changes to her appearance.
Yeah, I know who you're talking about.
Right.
Yeah.
And they basically just say to her, "I want to get black."
Mm.
Yeah.
It's amazing how just a few words can reveal such a deep desire,
Yeah. It's pretty powerful. So it seems like so far we're seeing a lot of wanting to connect with a culture, wanting to be accepted,
Mm-hmm.
feeling like their birth race just doesn't match who they are inside.
Absolutely.
But, our sources also touch on some other, maybe more difficult motivations too.
Yeah, you're right. There are some heavier things at play here as well.
Like this Reddit post from Black to White Transracials. It's pretty heartbreaking, honestly.
Yeah.
It's from a black woman living in Europe, and she talks about dealing with intense internalized racism.
Wow.
And tragically, a member of her family actually attempted suicide. And one of the main reasons was because they hated being black.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it's really heavy stuff. And the woman who wrote the post, she talks about seeing a side of me that I have never seen before after that.
Yeah, that's powerful.
It makes you think about how sometimes this desire to be a different race might not be about wanting to be something else,
Right.
but more about wanting to escape the pain of what you are.
Like it's a way to distance yourself from something that feels negative or oppressive.
Exactly. And to make matters even heavier, her family, they went to therapy,
Okay.
but they made a conscious decision to just not talk about race anymore.
Mm.
They called it cope culture.
Interesting. So they're basically trying to shut out a huge part of their identity, of their reality.
Yeah, and it's really sad to think that, their experience with race has been so painful
Hmm.
that they feel like they have to do that. And, this actually ties back to what Topin was saying.
Oh, really? How so?
Remember how they talked about being bullied?
Yeah.
And then finding acceptance after they started, presenting themselves in a way that people associated with a different race?
Right, right.
Well, it makes you wonder if maybe for some people, identifying as transracial is about trying to escape that kind of negativity.
That makes sense. I mean, the need to belong, to feel safe, is incredibly strong.
Yeah. If someone's been treated badly because of how they look or how people perceive their race, it's understandable that they might want to find a group where they feel like they fit in.
Absolutely. It highlights that this isn't always about a lifelong feeling of being the wrong race.
Right.
Sometimes it's a response to a really difficult situation.
So we've got this whole spectrum of motivations going on.
Yeah,
Deep connection to a culture, desire to belong, trying to escape pain, trying to escape negativity.
right.
It's a lot more complicated than just someone flipping a switch and saying, I'm this race now.
Absolutely.
But hold on, because our sources also bring up some pretty important criticisms and nuances that we can't ignore.
Oh, yeah, there are definitely some other sides to this.
Like this YouTube video, In Defense of Transracialism, RCTA, it makes a point that, a lot of people agree with. Race is a social construct.
Right. There's no scientific basis for these rigid categories. It's something we've created as a society.
Exactly. So if it's a social construct, why can't it be more fluid?
Right.
Like, why can't someone choose their race like some people choose their gender?
Yeah, that's a valid question.
But then the same video points to people like Ollie London, who have been accused of, well, basically being really superficial about the whole thing.
Right, of just appropriating a culture for attention or personal gain.
And the concern is that these people, they didn't grow up with the struggles and experiences of that race.
Yeah, that's a huge point of contention. You can't just adopt the fun, aesthetically pleasing parts of a culture without acknowledging the very real challenges that come with it.
Exactly. And it raises the question, would someone really want to take on the negative parts of being a certain race just to, justify their identity?
That's a really thought-provoking point.
Yeah. It's like, is it really about the race itself, or is it about an idealized, maybe even romanticized version of it?
It's a good question, and this whole idea of cultural appropriation and beauty standards gets even more complicated when you look at something like the text RCTA, understanding RCTA.
Oh, yeah. What about that?
Well, it basically says that when people try to change their race through things like cosmetics, it can actually reinforce racism and colorism.
Because it's like you're saying, lighter skin is better.
Exactly.
And the Wikipedia entry on race, human categorization, makes a similar point, that these categories aren't just about personal choice.
Right.
They're also linked to power and inequality in a lot of societies.
Mm.
So even if we start to see race as more fluid, we can't ignore those real-world consequences.
Absolutely.
But what's interesting is that in some of these sources, people are comparing transracialism to transgender identity,
Oh, yeah, that came up a lot.
like this academic paper, Transgender, Transracial.
Yeah, I read that one.
It talks about this argument from similarity.
Right, where some people say, look, if we accept that transgender people are truly the gender they identify as, then we should also accept transracial identities.
Good exact.
And then others flip that argument completely and use the controversy around transracialism to try and undermine transgender people.
Wow.
So it's kind of a double-edged sword depending on who's wielding it.
Yeah, it's being used to both support and attack, depending on what someone already believes.
Exactly.
The paper also talks about something called boundary work.
Mm.
What's that all about?
So boundary work is basically how we as a society draw lines between different categories. In this case, it's about the line between changing your gender and changing your race.
Okay.
A lot of times, changing gender is seen as coming from a deep internal sense of self, right?
Yeah.
But changing race, that's often framed as a choice.
Which makes it seem less authentic.
Right, and especially if you're talking about someone from a dominant racial group adopting elements of a marginalized group, it can seem like appropriation.
Yeah, like you're taking something that doesn't belong to you.
Exactly. And this legal scholar, Jody Armour, he really hits the nail on the head with this point.
What do you say?
He said, Michael Brown couldn't be transracial.
Oh, wow.
And what he means is that Michael Brown, who was tragically killed by police, he couldn't just choose to be a different race and escape the reality of being Black in America.
Right. It's a stark reminder that race isn't just about how you feel inside.
Exactly. It's also about how society sees you and how that shapes your experiences, especially when it comes to things like systemic racism and violence.
It's a really powerful point. And it makes you think about those online communities that are forming around transracialism.
Yeah, like the Reddit subreddits are transracial and Rask Transrace, and that Discord server we saw.
It's clear that there are people out there who are really looking for connection and support around this.
For sure. They want to find people who understand what they're going through.
And the different flares they have on our transracial, like positivity, news and media, even spirituality.
It shows you that this is more than just a casual interest for some people.
Right. It's a huge part of how they see themselves.
Absolutely. But those communities are probably also places where there's a lot of debate.
About what it means to be transracial.
Right. And how that fits into the bigger picture of society.
So I guess what we've learned here is that there's no easy answer.
Yeah.
The motivations behind identifying as transracial are incredibly diverse and complex.
Yeah. We've seen everything from deep cultural connections to trying to escape trauma to wanting to belong to challenging the very concept of race.
And there are people who are doing this in ways that feel really authentic,
Mm-hmm.
and others who are being criticized for being superficial or appropriative.
It's a spectrum, that's for sure.
It all just brings up so many questions about identity,
Yeah.
about the power of social constructs, about the ethics of all of this. It's a lot to think about.
It really is. And as we wrap things up here, we want to leave you with one final thought.
Yeah.
Given that most people agree that race is a social construct, and with more and more acceptance of, fluidity in things like gender identity,
Hmm.
how should we as a society approach this whole idea of transracial identification?
Yeah, that's the big question.
What are the ethical lines?
How do we balance personal freedom with, the very real impact of history and inequality?
Exactly. These are really complex questions, and we hope that by looking at all of this, these different viewpoints and experiences,
Mhm.
it'll help you form your own opinions.
Yeah, keep the conversation going. That's what we're all about.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
And we'll see you next time.